when you were working at the IVF clinic and you're dealing every day with making life or death decisions for hundreds, maybe even thousands of these embryos, did the other people working with you were there any kind of moral moments that they experienced where they had a moral qualm with the kind of power they were wielding and the decisions that they were making?
I think that in the sense of grieving with the patients, when someone wasn't pregnant, when we had those situations where we're sitting together and there are no embryos to transfer, for example, like, of course, there is real grief and love for our patients, like, absolutely, without a doubt. But in the sense of, again, being the ones who are guiding these people who are coming to us as experts and guiding them to give them the best, safest, moral way to deal with their fertility. I know I can speak for myself. I don't feel like I was able to do that. And I think it was because of, again, for me, it was very much like a spiritual blindness of what life is when it starts. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance here that I could be the purported expert in fertility and women's health and embryos and all of these things that I'm dealing with, and still be able to just accept that, oh, life begins at implantation. Okay. No, it doesn't. I could literally see those embryos growing from day to day in those dishes. Again, from one cell to hundreds. What happens normally? What happens normally is that the egg and the sperm meet in the tube, in the fallopian tube. And then that embryo is then created in the outer part of the tube, starts dividing really rapidly. By the time that embryo gets into the uterine cavity, it's a process. It's actually 5 days later. And that embryo, again, as I said to you, is hundreds of cells at that point. And so that's when we typically transfer those embryos back, is on day 5. And so if it's a fresh transfer. And so to know that, but not to realize that that embryo is living, to know that the chromosomes in that embryo are unique and separate, and will create a live-born human being if given the chance to continue to do what they're doing already in that dish, and to not have that be at the forefront of how we're counseling patients, I think is, again, one of the reasons I believe that we need to have alternatives, and that there are better alternatives, and that the practice of IVF, again, as I say all the time, just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should. And I know I have to say 2 points. I feel for people with infertility with all my heart. This is why I'm doing this. I truly love what I do. I love walking alongside of people in the best of times and in the worst of times. We cannot lose sight of the embryos, though. We cannot be so focused that we forget about all of these human beings that are the most vulnerable, and that are not being treated the way that they should be, which is with the utmost of care, because they are the most vulnerable. And then secondly, I really want to also emphasize, because I think this is another point of confusion for people, any child who is created, any child who is born, who was conceived through IVF, is a beautiful blessing, of course. And I would say that, God can bring good out of anything, and that child is the good that comes from, even when we pursue these types of treatments for that creation,
Such an important point. And I know it makes the conversation all the more sensitive. You have people really suffering through infertility, and then you have those that were IVF, conceived, or they are parents that have children conceived in IVF, a niece or a grandchild. And it's so personal. And like you say, these children are the whole point of why IVF is fraught and a problem is not because life isn't precious, but because life is precious.
Yes.
And these children who are conceived, every single one of them, the ones that made it, the ones that are frozen, and the ones that have been destroyed, every single one of them are so precious. And that's the reason we're talking about this.
Yeah.
That's the reason this matters.